Jason had always considered his marriage to Sarah to be one of mutual respect and love. They had been together for over 16 years, through the highs and lows of life. They had built a family together with 2 kids, Sophie, 12, and Ben, 9. Jason worked as a software engineer, while Sarah had always been the creative soul, working as a freelance photographer. They had a comfortable life, with their home filled with the laughter of children and the routine that made them feel secure. But as the years passed, things began to shift. Jason noticed subtle changes in Sarah. She started staying late for work, and her phone became a constant source of distraction. She would check it obsessively, often locking it away the moment Jason entered the room. At first, Jason chalked it up to work stress or maybe just a phase. But as the weeks passed, the distance between them seemed to grow. Their once strong emotional connection began to feel strained, and Jason couldn't help but wonder if something more was going on. It wasn't until one fateful evening that the truth began to unravel. Jason had been working late at home when he received a message from his best friend, Mark. Mark had always been a reliable source of support, but tonight, the message was unsettling. Mark, "Hey man, you need to see this. I'm really sorry." Jason's stomach twisted. He clicked on the link Mark had sent him, expecting some lighthearted joke or video, but what he saw made his heart race in an instant. The video was grainy, taken from what looked like a security camera at a restaurant. It showed Sarah sitting at a table across from a man Jason didn't recognize. They were talking, laughing, and at one point, the man reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from Sarah's face. She didn't pull away. The intimacy between them was clear. Jason felt the blood drain from his face as he watched the video again. This wasn't a simple dinner with a colleague. This was something else entirely. The caption under the video only deepened his shock. "Wife of 16 years caught out having dinner with her lover while her husband is at home with their kids. Guess he doesn't know." Jason sat there, paralyzed, as the comments filled the screen. "I feel so bad for the guy. He has no idea. She's not even trying to hide it. I bet he doesn't even know she's been seeing him for months." Jason's heart sank further with each comment. His mind was racing. How long had this been going on? Was this the man Sarah had been meeting for months, the one he had noticed her texting late at night? His suspicion had always been there, but now it was undeniable. His wife, the woman he had trusted with his heart, had been seeing someone else behind his back. Jason needed answers. But he wasn't ready to confront Sarah yet, not without more proof. The next day, Jason couldn't focus on anything. His thoughts kept returning to the video, to the way Sarah had smiled at the man across from her, the way she seemed so at ease. He had never seen her look at him like that in years. He spent the day in a haze, barely able to focus at work. All he could think about was the video, and what he was going to do next. That evening, when Sarah came home, Jason decided he couldn't wait any longer. He had to confront her. As she walked in, she smiled at him, but Jason could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She knew something was off. "Hey," Sarah said, setting down her bag. "How was your day?" Jason didn't answer. He pulled out his phone, showing her the video. Her face drained of color as she saw the grainy footage of her with the man in the restaurant. "Who is he?" Jason's voice was cold, his heart hammering in his chest. "How long has this been going on?" Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting away from him. "Jason, I can explain." She reached out for his hand, but he pulled it away. "Explain?" Jason repeated, his voice rising. "Explain what, Sarah? What am I supposed to believe here? You've been sneaking around behind my back. You've been seeing him, haven't you?" Tears filled Sarah's eyes. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, her voice trembling. It just, it just happened. I never wanted to hurt you. Jason was shaking now. The betrayal burned through him, hotter than any anger he had ever felt. Who is he, Sarah? He asked again, his voice steady but filled with devastation. Her face crumpled, and she finally spoke the name. His name is Daniel, she whispered. I met him a while ago. It started as a friendship, but it turned into something more. I never wanted to hurt you, Jason. I swear. Jason couldn't breathe. How long, Sarah? How long has this been going on? About 6 months, she confessed, her voice barely audible. Jason stood there speechless. 6 months. 6 months of betrayal, of lies. He had trusted her. He had built their life together, and now, in a single moment, it had all come crashing down. The room felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around Jason. 6 months. 6 months of his life, of their marriage, had been a lie. Sarah's confession hung in the air, its weight crushing him. He had known something was off for months, but he had never imagined it would be this. Never imagined that Sarah, his wife, the mother of his children, could betray him so completely. For a long moment, there was only silence. Jason couldn't speak, couldn't form the words to express what he was feeling. The hurt, the anger, the sense of betrayal, it all felt too overwhelming. He had thought they were solid, unshakable. He had thought they had built something real, something lasting. And now, in an instant, it was all gone. Sarah stood in front of him, tears streaming down her face. She reached for him again, but Jason stepped back, his body rigid with anger. He couldn't look at her right now. He couldn't bring himself to touch her, to comfort her when she had done this to him. Why, Sarah? Jason's voice was low, hoarse with emotion. Why did you do this? After everything we've been through, how could you do this to me? To us? I don't know, Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. It just happened. I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I could control it, but I couldn't. I felt like I was losing myself. I don't even know who I am anymore. Jason shook his head, unable to comprehend her words. He had spent his life with this woman, trusted her completely, and she had just shattered everything in the most devastating way. 6 months, Sarah. 6 months of you lying to me. Lying to our kids, Jason said, his voice growing louder. How am I supposed to trust you again? How am I supposed to look at you the same way? She collapsed onto the couch, her body shaking with sobs. I'm so sorry, Jason, she cried. I never meant for it to happen. I didn't want to hurt you. I just felt lost. And Daniel, he made me feel like I was seen, like I mattered. Jason's heart hardened as he listened to her excuses. She wasn't taking responsibility for what she had done. It was always someone else's fault, always someone else to blame. But Jason couldn't afford to make excuses for her anymore. Not after what she had done. I don't care about your excuses, Sarah, Jason said, his voice steady but cold. What matters is the truth. And the truth is, you've been sleeping with him behind my back for months. You've been lying to me, to our family. And now, I have to figure out what to do with all of this. He could see the guilt in her eyes, but it wasn't enough. The pain he was feeling wasn't something she could undo with apologies. She had already made her choice. And now, he had to face the consequences of it. The next day, Jason's world continued to spiral. He spent the entire night staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment he had spent with Sarah in the last few months, searching for any sign that he had missed, any clue that could have pointed him toward the truth. But there were none. The lies were so well hidden, so carefully constructed, that he hadn't seen them. And now, he was left trying to pick up the pieces. The next morning, as the sun filtered through the blinds, Jason made a decision. He couldn't live in this limbo any longer. He couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. His marriage was over. It was time to face the reality of their situation. But as painful as it was, there was one more thing Jason needed to know: the truth about their children. For years, Jason had been their father. He had raised Sophie and Ben as his own, loved them, cared for them. But after everything that had come to light, one question gnawed at him: were they his? The thought of it was unbearable. But Jason knew he had to find out. He couldn't move forward, couldn't make any decisions about his future until he knew the truth. So, with a sense of dread settling over him, he made the decision to order DNA tests for Sophie and Ben. A week later, Jason sat in his car, the envelope from the testing facility clenched tightly in his hands. His heart raced as he stared at the sealed envelope, the weight of the decision he had made crashing down on him. What if the test revealed something he didn't want to know? What if he wasn't their father? He opened the envelope with trembling hands, his stomach in knots. The results were printed clearly on the paper. He scanned them quickly, his eyes stopping on the names at the top. Sophie, probability of paternity, 0%. Ben, probability of paternity, 0%. Jason couldn't breathe. The world seemed to tilt beneath him as he read the words again, his mind refusing to process the reality before him. 0%? It was impossible. He had raised Sophie and Ben for years. They were his children in every way that mattered. Or so he had thought. His hand shook as he read the results again, but there was no denying it. The DNA test didn't lie. Sophie and Ben weren't his. They were the product of Sarah's affair with Daniel. Jason sat in stunned silence, the full weight of the betrayal crashing over him. Everything he thought he knew, everything he had built, had been a lie. Sarah had deceived him in the most profound way possible. And now, he was faced with the truth: his children weren't his. The shock of the DNA test results hit Jason harder than anything else. He had already been reeling from Sarah's betrayal, but now he was faced with the realization that the children he had raised and loved for over a decade weren't even his biologically. It felt like a crushing blow to his identity. Everything he had known, everything he had worked for, had been built on a foundation of lies. He didn't know how to process the truth. How could he face Sophie and Ben? How could he explain to them that the man they had called Dad for all these years wasn't their biological father? But as the anger and disbelief slowly started to fade, Jason came to a heartbreaking realization. Sophie and Ben were his children, no matter the blood that ran through their veins. He had been there for them, loved them, and raised them. He had been their father in every way that mattered. And nothing could change that. Jason's hands trembled as he set the DNA results down on the kitchen counter. He stared at them, the cold, hard truth reflected back at him. 0%. He had raised Sophie and Ben as his own for over a decade, and now, in an instant, everything had changed. He wasn't their biological father. The words echoed in his mind, but they didn't make sense. He had spent countless hours with them, helped them with homework, comforted them when they were sick, held them when they cried. They were his children in every sense of the word. But now, as he stood in the kitchen, the foundation of his entire life seemed to crumble around him. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady his breath. The revelation wasn't just painful, it was a blow to his identity. Who was he now? The realization that the children he had loved and cared for might not be his left him feeling lost, disconnected. As the tears began to form in his eyes, he heard footsteps approaching from behind. Sophie walked into the room, her face lighting up when she saw him standing there. "Dad, I finished my homework." she said, her excitement palpable. Can we watch a movie tonight? Jason swallowed hard, his throat tight. He couldn't look at her the same way anymore. He didn't know how to explain this to her, how to break her heart in the same way his had been shattered. Of course, honey, he said, his voice cracking. We'll watch a movie. Just give me a minute, okay? Sophie nodded and walked away, her innocent smile fading when she saw the look on her father's face. Jason couldn't help but feel like he was betraying her by even considering what he was about to do. But the truth weighed too heavily on his heart. He had to confront Sarah. He had to know why. That afternoon, he met Sarah at the park to have the conversation he had been avoiding. The weight of the situation had been building for days. The DNA test results had broken him, but he needed to face her, to hear the truth from her lips. When Sarah arrived, she looked tired, the weight of the past few weeks clearly taking its toll on her. But even in her exhaustion, she still wore that familiar smile that used to make Jason's heart race. It felt like a cruel joke now. She greeted him hesitantly. Jason, she said softly, as though unsure of how to approach him. How are you holding up? Jason didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope with the DNA results. He held it out to her, his hand shaking. What is this, Jason? She asked, her voice trembling as she took the envelope from his hand. She glanced at the paper inside and her face went pale. Where did you get this? The test results, Jason said, his voice low. They're not my kids, Sarah. Sophie and Ben, they're not mine. I've raised them, loved them, and now I find out I'm not their father. Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Jason's heart broke at the sight of her. She was a woman he had loved for years, a woman who had shared his life, and now she was just a stranger to him. I didn't know how to tell you, she whispered. I thought I could keep it a secret. I never wanted you to find out like this. Jason's anger flared, but he controlled it. You thought you could keep it a secret? For how long, Sarah? For how long have you been lying to me? How long have you been letting me raise children that weren't even mine? She trembled, her voice barely audible. I never wanted to hurt you, Jason. I made a mistake. It started with Daniel. He was there when I felt so alone. I didn't think it would go this far, but it did. And I didn't know what to do. I never meant to betray you. Jason's hands clenched into fists. He felt the betrayal in every fiber of his being. You think this is just about you and Daniel? This isn't just about you, Sarah. It's about the kids. Sophie and Ben. You took everything from me. You let me believe I was their father, and now I have to deal with the fact that they're not even mine by blood. Sarah's tears flowed freely now, her body shaking. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't want this to happen. I never meant to hurt you or the kids. I don't even know how I let this happen. I was lost. I was so lost, Jason. Jason turned away, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed air, needed space. He needed to clear his head. He didn't know what to say anymore. He was done with the excuses, done with the lies. Everything had changed, and there was no going back. Later that night, as Jason sat alone in the dark, he couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with Sarah. The pain in her eyes had been genuine, but it didn't matter. She had destroyed everything. He had built his life around the idea that he was a good father, a good husband. But now, all of that was in question. He was lost. He didn't know who he was anymore. And the worst part was that Sophie and Ben, the children he had loved and cared for, were now at the center of his heartbreak. Have you ever suspected someone of cheating, but never had proof? Write in the comments. How could he tell them the truth? How could he explain the lies, the betrayal? Jason knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still so many questions that remained unanswered. But one thing was certain, he couldn't move forward without facing the truth. It was time to let go of the past, to find a way to rebuild his life, for himself and for his children. Jason's nights became filled with sleepless hours, thoughts swirling like a storm that he couldn't calm. His mind was consumed with the consequences of the truth he had uncovered, the realization that Sophie and Ben were not his biological children had fractured his sense of self. But worse than that was the devastating reality that Sarah, the woman he had loved and trusted for so long, had not only betrayed him, but had kept him in the dark for years. The days following their confrontation were spent in a haze. Jason tried to focus on work, but every moment was tainted by the gnawing doubt that he wasn't the man he thought he was. Sophie and Ben looked up to him as their father, but now, knowing what he knew, he couldn't help but wonder how much of their love for him had been rooted in the truth. How would they react when the full reality came to light? The idea of telling them crushed him, but he knew that it was inevitable. The days were long, and each one seemed to drag by. Jason hadn't spoken to Sarah much since their meeting. She had sent him a few text messages apologizing, trying to explain herself, but Jason couldn't bring himself to read them. The anger still simmered beneath the surface, and he didn't know how to move forward from here. But he had to be strong, for Sophie and Ben. They were the only thing keeping him grounded in this sea of chaos. He had to figure out what was best for them. Even if they weren't his by blood, they were his children in every way that mattered. He had been their father for so many years, and that wasn't something that could be undone by a test or a betrayal. It was late one evening when Jason finally made the decision to talk to Sophie and Ben. He couldn't keep avoiding the truth. They deserved to know what had happened, what had been happening behind their backs. But the thought of breaking their hearts, of shattering their perception of their family, weighed heavily on him. He wasn't sure how they would react, but he knew that lying to them would only make things worse in the long run. He waited until after dinner, when the house was quiet, and the kids were winding down for the night. Sophie was curled up on the couch, reading a book, while Ben played with his toys on the floor. Jason sat at the kitchen table, staring into his coffee cup, gathering the strength he would need for the conversation ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but filled with sadness. "Sophie, Ben, can you both come here for a minute?" Sophie looked up from her book, sensing the seriousness in his tone. Ben stood up from the floor and walked toward the kitchen, his usual energy replaced by a quiet curiosity. They both sat down at the table, their faces waiting for him to speak. Jason looked at them for a long moment, his heart breaking as he realized the gravity of what he was about to say. "There's something you need to know," he began, his voice soft. "Something I should have told you a long time ago. But it's hard to explain, and it's going to be difficult." The kids exchanged confused glances, and Jason could see the concern in their eyes. Sophie, ever the perceptive one, spoke first. "What is it, Dad?" she asked. "Is something wrong?" Jason took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I don't know how to say this, but it's important that you understand the truth. The truth about you." Sophie and Ben looked at each other again, their expressions growing more puzzled by the second. "Sophie, Ben," Jason continued, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to keep it steady. You're not my biological children." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and for a moment, the room was silent. Sophie's eyes widened, and Ben looked confused, unsure of what Jason had just said. "What do you mean?" Sophie asked, her voice quiet, but the hurt already seeping through her words. Jason swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep his composure. "What I mean is that your mother and well, I'm not your biological father." I've been raising you as my own all these years, and I love you both more than anything, but the truth is, I'm not your real dad." Sophie's face contorted with disbelief. "What? No, that doesn't make sense. You are my dad. You've always been my dad." Jason's chest tightened. "I know, sweetie, and that's not going to change. I've been your father in every way that matters, but the truth is, your mom and she wasn't honest with me. And now, I have to tell you the truth." Ben, who had been quiet up until now, looked up at Jason with wide eyes. "So you're not our real dad?" Jason's heart cracked as he looked at them, the confusion and pain in their eyes cutting him to the core. "I am your dad, Ben. Nothing changes that. But I need you to understand that sometimes things aren't what they seem. I'm so sorry I didn't tell you sooner." The room was filled with a silence that was heavy with the weight of the truth. Sophie's eyes welled up with tears, and Ben, who was too young to fully grasp what Jason was saying, started to cry, his small body trembling. Jason stood up, his heart breaking as he walked over to them, pulling them both into a tight hug. "I'm sorry. I wish I could have protected you from this, but I can't change what happened. I love you both, and that will never change." Sophie sobbed quietly against his chest, her words muffled as she spoke. But why? Why didn't you tell us? Why did she lie to us?" Jason held her tighter, trying to comfort her as best he could. "I don't have all the answers, Sophie. Your mom made mistakes, big ones. And I'm still trying to understand all of it myself. But I want you to know that you are my kids. You are loved. No matter what the truth is, that will never change." The weight of that conversation hung in the air long after the kids had gone to bed. Jason sat alone in the living room, the silence surrounding him as he tried to process everything. He had always been their father, and in his heart, that would never change. But the pain of this truth, the hurt in his children's eyes, was something he wasn't sure he would ever recover from. Sarah had shattered their family, and now Jason had to piece it back together. But as he sat there, looking at the family photos on the wall, he realized one thing. No matter what happened, no matter what the truth was, Sophie and Ben were his. They had always been his. And for now, that was enough. The days following Jason's conversation with Sophie and Ben were some of the hardest of his life. The truth, as painful as it was, had been spoken, and the damage was done. Sophie had retreated into herself, burying her emotions, while Ben had started to act out more than usual. Both of them were struggling to comprehend the truth that their world had just been turned upside down. Jason's heart ached as he saw the confusion and sadness in their eyes. He could feel the weight of their pain, and it crushed him. He had always been their father, his children, in every sense of the word. Yet now, he had to help them process the unthinkable. The man they had always called Dad wasn't their biological father. The realization felt like a deep wound for Jason, but more than that, it was a wound that would never fully heal for Sophie and Ben. They were in the midst of a storm, one Jason could only hope to help them weather. He spent his days in a haze, trying to figure out how to repair the fractured relationship with his children. There were times when he felt like he was drowning, but he couldn't give up. He couldn't let them down. He knew he had to be strong, even when he felt weak, for the sake of his family. Sarah, on the other hand, continued to reach out to him, sending text messages and emails, apologizing profusely for her betrayal. But Jason couldn't bring himself to respond. The words felt empty, and as much as he hated the distance between them, he couldn't imagine rebuilding anything with her. She had shattered the trust they had built over 16 years. He didn't know if it was possible to forgive her, even if he ever wanted to. 2 weeks later, Jason finally agreed to meet with Sarah, if only to close this chapter of his life. He needed answers, closure, something to help him understand why she had made the choices she did. The pain of betrayal had eaten away at him, and though he didn't know what he would get out of this meeting, he couldn't keep avoiding it. He had to face her, even if it meant confronting the anger and heartbreak that still simmered in his chest. They met at a small cafe in town, the same place where they had shared so many quiet afternoons before everything fell apart. Sarah was already sitting at a table when Jason arrived, her eyes red from the tears that had likely been shed during the last few weeks. She looked so different to him now, like a stranger. "Jason," she said softly, standing as he approached. I I don't even know how to begin." Jason sat down across from her, his gaze hard. "You don't have to say anything, Sarah. I don't need your apologies anymore. It's done." But Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke. "I know. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't even begin to comprehend. But I'm not asking for forgiveness, Jason. I just want you to understand. I never wanted to hurt you. I was lonely. I was lost." Jason's jaw clenched. "Lonely? So you think that's an excuse for what you did? For lying to me? For lying to our kids?" He shook his head, the anger bubbling up again. "I've been raising those kids for years, Sarah. I've been their father, and you let me think I was their dad when I wasn't. Do you understand what you've done to me? To them?" "I do," Sarah whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "And I hate myself for it. I've spent every day since this came to light wondering how I could have been so selfish. I never wanted to lose you. I never wanted to lose our family." Jason stared at her, his eyes cold. "But you did. You made that choice. You made it long before I ever found out about it." There was a long pause as Sarah wiped her eyes, trying to collect herself. "I know. And I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve that. But I just wanted you to know that it wasn't about you. It wasn't because of something you did. It was my mistake, my failure." Jason leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He wanted to hate her. He wanted to scream, to tell her how much she had hurt him, how much this had broken everything. But as much as he resented her for what she had done, something inside him knew that the relationship they once had was irreparably broken. There was no going back. "Why, Sarah?" Jason asked, his voice quieter now. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning? Why did you let me raise them, love them, when they weren't even mine?" Sarah looked away, her voice barely audible. "I was scared. I was scared of losing everything. And once it started, I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to face you, how to face myself. I thought I could hide it, but I can't. And now everything's falling apart." Jason sat silently, staring at her, his mind filled with a storm of emotions. He had spent so much time trying to hold onto the love they had, but the truth was too much to ignore. He couldn't change what had happened. He couldn't fix the brokenness inside him or between them. "I don't know what to say to you, Sarah," Jason finally said, his voice weary. "I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I ever will. I don't expect you to." Sarah replied softly. I just wanted to say how sorry I am. For everything." Jason nodded, feeling a finality in her words. "It's over, Sarah. You've made your choices, and I've made mine. I don't know what the future holds, but I have to move on from this. I have to focus on the kids, on what's best for them. I can't keep holding on to the past." When Jason left the cafe, a strange sense of closure washed over him. He hadn't gotten the answers he expected, but he had reached a point where he could let go. The truth, as painful as it was, had set him free in a way. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could control how he moved forward. He could be the father Sophie and Ben needed, the one who would be there for them, no matter what. The future wasn't certain, and there was still much healing to be done. But as he walked to his car, Jason knew that he had taken the first step toward rebuilding his life and his relationship with his children. And that, he realized, was enough. In the weeks that followed his confrontation with Sarah, Jason began to slowly rebuild his life, though the process felt like a heavy burden he had to carry alone. The pain of her betrayal still lingered in his heart, and the emotional weight of the DNA test results had yet to fully subside. But every morning, as he looked at Sophie and Ben, he knew that he had to push forward. They needed him, and he couldn't afford to let them down. Jason knew that he couldn't change the past, no matter how much he wished he could. The lies Sarah had told, the years spent raising children who weren't biologically his, were truths that couldn't be erased. But what mattered now, what would shape the future, was how he responded to those truths. His children needed consistency and love more than ever, and Jason was determined to give that to them. Sophie, who had been so quiet in the days following the revelation, started to open up again. She would sit with Jason on the couch after dinner, talking about her day, her schoolwork, and her friends. Though there was a noticeable sadness in her eyes, Jason could see that she was trying to move forward, trying to make sense of everything. Ben, too, had started to return to his usual self, though his outbursts were more frequent. He had always been the more energetic of the two, but now his energy seemed to come from a place of frustration and confusion. Jason knew that healing would take time, and it wasn't going to be easy. He had to be there for them, to show them that no matter what had happened between him and Sarah, he would always be their father. He would always be there for them. And with each passing day, he found that the love he had for them was still strong, stronger than anything that had happened in the past. One afternoon, as Jason was sitting in the living room reading the paper, he heard a knock on the door. He opened it to find Sarah standing on the doorstep, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked fragile, broken in a way that Jason had never seen before. "Jason, please," she said, her voice shaking. "I need to talk to you." Jason's heart hardened, but he couldn't bring himself to turn her away. "What do you want, Sarah?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. I just want to apologize again," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, and I can't keep living with the guilt of what I did. I ruined everything. I ruined our family." Jason stared at her for a long moment, his heart conflicted. He had spent so many years loving her, trusting her, and now she was here, asking for forgiveness. But how could he forgive her? How could he look past the betrayal? "I don't know what to say to you, Sarah," Jason said, his voice quiet. "I don't know if I can forgive you. You hurt me, you hurt the kids. You've already made your choices." "I know," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "And I'll live with that for the rest of my life. But I need you to understand that I never wanted to hurt you. I was selfish. I thought I could find happiness with someone else, but I didn't realize how much I would destroy in the process." Jason looked away, his jaw tight with the effort to hold back the tears that threatened to rise. "You can't undo what's been done, Sarah. And I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I could ever look at you the same way again. But I'm trying to move on. For me and for the kids." Sarah's face crumpled, and she wiped away a tear. "I understand. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I wish I could go back and change everything, but I can't." Jason nodded, his heart heavy. "I know you're sorry, Sarah. But I need to think about what's best for me and the kids now. We need space." Sarah didn't argue. She just nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I understand. I'll leave you to it." As she turned to leave, Jason felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. He had been holding on to the past for too long, trying to fix something that was broken beyond repair. Now, he knew that it was time to let go. Time to let Sarah go for both of their sakes. As the weeks continued to pass, Jason found himself settling into a new routine. The pain of betrayal still lingered in the back of his mind, but it was becoming easier to focus on what mattered most: his children. They had slowly started to heal, though there were still moments when the weight of the truth would catch up with them. But they were resilient, and Jason was there every step of the way, helping them navigate their emotions and fears. One evening, as he was tucking Ben into bed, Ben looked up at him with wide eyes. "Dad," Ben said quietly, his voice unsure, "are you going to leave us too?" Jason froze, his heart stopping for a moment. He hadn't realized how deeply this situation had affected Ben. He had been so focused on keeping things together, on being strong for both of them, that he hadn't stopped to consider what was going on inside Ben's mind. "No, buddy," Jason said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm always going to be here for you, no matter what. You're my son. That will never change." Ben nodded, his small face still filled with uncertainty. Jason leaned down and kissed him on the forehead, holding him close for a moment longer than usual. "I love you, Ben, and nothing will ever change that." As he left the room, Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It wasn't going to be easy, and there was still a long road ahead. But he had done it. He had taken the first steps toward healing, for both himself and his children. And even though the past could never be erased, Jason knew that he would keep moving forward, one day at a time, one step at a time. As the months passed, Jason found himself adjusting to the new reality of his life. It wasn't easy. Nothing about this situation had been easy, but he was learning to find peace in the chaos. He had always been a man who thrived on stability, on knowing what was coming next, but now he was living in the unknown. Still, with each passing day, he was slowly reclaiming parts of himself that he thought he had lost forever. Sophie and Ben were adjusting too, though the emotional toll of the past year had left its mark on them. Sophie had started talking more about her feelings, though her eyes still held the sadness that Jason knew would take time to heal. Ben, on the other hand, seemed to be holding it all in, but Jason could see the flashes of anger in his eyes, the confusion, the frustration. It was hard to watch, but Jason knew they would get through it together. Jason had found a new sense of purpose in his role as their father. He had always been there for them, but now he was more present, more aware of the impact his actions had on their lives. He was learning to be more patient, more understanding, as they all worked through the emotional fallout of the past year. One evening, as Jason sat with Sophie and Ben on the couch watching an old movie, he realized how far they had come. They weren't the same family they had been a year ago, but they were still a family, one that had weathered the storm and was learning to rebuild. Sophie leaned her head against his shoulder, and Ben sat close by, his small hand resting in Jason's. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. After the movie ended, Sophie broke the silence. "Dad, can we talk?" Jason turned to her, his heart in his throat. "Of course, sweetie. What's on your mind?" Sophie hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I've been thinking about everything. About Mom. And about you." Jason's heart skipped a beat. "What about me, Soph? I think, I think I'm starting to understand," Sophie said, her voice quiet but strong. "I know Mom made a huge mistake, and I know things won't ever be the same. But I don't want to lose you too. You've always been there for me. And even though I'm really angry at Mom, I'm not angry at you. I don't want to be." Jason smiled, his eyes stinging with emotion. You won't lose me, Sophie. I'm always going to be here, no matter what. You're my daughter, and nothing's ever going to change that. Sophie nodded, a small, uncertain smile tugging at her lips. I know. And I'm glad. Jason's heart swelled with pride as he hugged her close. He knew it would take time for them all to heal, but hearing Sophie say those words filled him with hope. They would get through this, one day at a time. Later that evening, Jason sat alone in the living room, thinking about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the pain, but also the love, the strength, the resilience. In the face of it all, his family had survived. They had survived because of him, because of his love for Sophie and Ben. They had survived because he hadn't given up, even when it seemed like everything was falling apart. He knew that things would never be the same, that the scars of the past would always be there. But he also knew that he had the power to create a new future for them, one where love and trust were rebuilt, where the past didn't have to define them. As he sat there, his thoughts drifting to the future, Jason felt a deep sense of peace. He had lost something precious, yes, but he had also gained something. He had gained the strength to move forward, to protect his children, and to rebuild a family that had been broken. He had gained the power to let go of the past and embrace the future. And that, in the end, was enough.